We also have some people waiting. Should I admit them?
We have admitted them already. All right. Hello and welcome back. And welcome to those who were not there in the previous session. We had a fascinating discussion on pathways to public participation, things concerning the local government, and now we are right out from the stratosphere. So this particular discussion is about space. It's named as Beyond the Stratosphere: Policy, Diplomacy, and Sustainability for Outer Space. A very new topic, a very interesting topic for all of us, including myself. Another, person, Shelley Brunswick, she was there in the previous panel in the audience. She's going to be a mentor, and she is a space policy expert. She's going to be a mentor in the second part of GPODS, and that we are going to be hearing a lot more and learning a lot more from her about space policy. But then this is our own foray from the first cohort itself into what space policy looks like and what does it have in it for us. I am glad to be joined by an eminent panel of GPODS fellows. That's the Global Policy, Diplomacy, and Sustainability fellows. And I'm going to introduce them, and I'm going to start with Arif. Arif brings in a lot of experience from the corporate sector. He has worked with a number of organizations such as Capgemini, Indus Towers, HCL Technologies. He holds an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management. Thank you, Arif, for joining us. We also have with us Maushmi Mehta, who's a lawyer. She graduated from the Government Law College in 2018, and she is she's been in courses on international law. She's completed one from the London School of Economics, and she went on to publish a paper on international humanitarian law and presented that paper in some very prestigious conferences co-hosted by UNHRC and ICRC. Thanks, Moshmi, for being part of this panel. We also have Himaki Rathore. Himaki has a bachelor's with honors in history from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. She has worked with Viacom Media, and she has driven the company and community strategy for consulting firms like Touchdown Gurus. And she's worked in a number of fields such as community building in the northeastern region of India on the tourism and healthcare side, and has worked on various entrepreneurship development initiatives. So Himaki, welcome to the discussion. We're also joined by Mohit Gurnani. Mohit is a Teach for India alumnus who has 5+ years of work experience working with not-for-profits in the education sector. He has worked on a wide variety of roles from program design, implementation, and evaluation. Currently, Mohit is working as a consultant with 321 Education Foundation. Mohit is the go-to person if you want to talk about design thinking, about behavioral economics and stuff like that, optimizing systems. I've had fascinating conversations with Mohit, so thank you for joining us over here. We're also joined by Moritz Dappen. Moritz has worked as a political advisor at the permanent mission of the Federal Republic of Germany to the United Nations. He has also been a public affairs consultant at BW Consulting, which is an in-house consultancy of the German Armed Forces. Moritz is coming right out of a panel. In fact, Moritz and Arif, Moritz was speaking, not Arif, but Moritz was speaking in the previous panel. So I can imagine Moritz would be tired, but still kicked enough equally for this particular panel and to discuss the diplomacy and security aspects of space policy. We are also, last but not the least, joined by Arundhati Pandey. Arundhati is a former development professional working in the sphere of rural agriculture, livelihoods, and climate change. She's also part of the World Economic Forum's initiative on Global Shapers community. At 20, she was amongst the youngest shapers to be nominated and has been growing since then along with the community. Arundhati, thanks a lot for joining this panel, and we are looking forward to hearing from you. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about the format for today's discussion. We're going to have opening remarks from each of our panelists that'll last for 2 minutes. I'll pose an opening question, and the panelists would talk about why is space policy, diplomacy, and sustainability important, and what do we really mean by space policy, diplomacy, and sustainability. So that's what's going to be my prompt. And after the opening statements from our fellows, we will jump into a 30-minute back and forth discussion where we explore various aspects of how space policy looks like right now, what's the state of the art, and what does the future look like? What can we expect, or what are the things that we would want to see in space policy going forward in the future? And finally, in the last half an hour of this discussion, we'll open the chat box out for the audience. And we'd like to hear from you, your questions, your comments, your thoughts, and our panelists would be responding to that. So with that, I'd like to open it out with Arundhati. Arundhati, my question being, again, that what do we really mean by space policy? It's not something that we discuss so much. It's not something that we understand a lot. And why is it important?
Thanks, Arpit. Good evening, everyone, or good day, depending on wherever you are. I'd like to actually start with saying that I'm one of those believers who thinks that we are just like a tiny speck in the universe. And we are actually having this discussion at a very apt point because recently only I was following the news, and China's Chang'e 5 just got back a moon crater from the moon into its lab in Beijing. So I think, and for a layperson like me, like it was a very interesting tidbit, but I think I understand that it whole outer space and the space exploration involves great resources and knowledge and technology. So I think it is very, very important to make whole discussion of outer space or stratosphere mainstream. This discourse has to come into the mainstream. So I think this is very important. And going forward, if not the most, it's a very, very significant thing for humanity. So yeah.
Thank you, Arundhati. And if I could invite Mohit to build on this, again, if I'm a layperson, how does space policy impact me, and what do I really mean? Like when you say space policy or space diplomacy, what do you really mean by it?
Thanks, Arpit, for the question, and thanks, Arundhati, for your opening remarks here. I will start with some space trivia to begin with to encourage like some kind of small questions here. So, can anybody tell me how many countries have space agencies, active space agencies, currently running at this point? I know it's a timed thing, so I can't wait a lot. So, if you can people type answers on the chat?
Aditi, can we open the chat box real quick? Okay, Moritz
Thanks,
Moritz.
10. 10, yeah. Okay, so we have around 100 plus countries which has a governmental space agency running at this point, with around 5 private space agencies that currently exist and 36 active members from UN Office of Outer Space that currently function. So, I mean, all of this information is kind of new, and I was very intrigued by when I read about this. But primarily the question is why space, and why do we even care about space at this point, right? And we don't really realize in a day-to-day functions, but things like connecting or talking to somebody on the mobile phone, using a sat-nav navigation to travel from one destination to the other, space technology is been impacting our lives in very different ways, and it's woven into our lives, but we don't really connect it to space as something that's really important to us. And that's why there is and just as we are currently using space technology and not really aware of it, there are so many ways that we, sorry?
Even right now.
Internet, correct, definitely. I mean, yeah, great point. So how our lives currently are affected by space technology at now, and what the potential holds for the future, there's lots that can be done here. None of us know what's out there in the space, but like the space aficionados, the scientists believe that there's so much more potential in terms of what we can get from space. And we don't even know how, if there are stuff there out there, how do we get from there to here is something that also is very intriguing, right? So given that there are so many ways how space can really affect and influence one's life now and in the future, there's a deep, it is a big part of it which says that it's really important for countries to have certain policies and guidelines and rules to ensure that there's no misuse of resources and for everybody, and there's more collaboration and cooperation that could potentially happen to basically use the resources out there in the space effectively. And that's primarily in layman terms on how I understood why space policy is an important aspect for us to consider at this point. Thank you.
Absolutely, Mohit. I think you've made a great point that even now we are using a lot of space technology as we are talking, and you know, what you said about just the fact that there's a lot that we expect and there's a lot that we are looking for out there, and there could be things that surprise us that we may not be looking for, but then we may just stumble upon and may be useful for our sustenance and survival. So thank you for bringing that up. If I could pass the baton to Moritz and hear your views on it.
Well, yes. As yeah, as Arundhati and Mohit already made some very good points, I just want to add that for myself, the most interesting thing is that today's activities are not just limited to research or commercial things. Yeah, they are also military. And when looking at this, I guess the most interesting, and for the people at the Earth, yeah, the people around us, most important thing is that those technology which is already used, for example, communication and navigation, or to maybe for climate observation, or research allocation, for example, or extraction. Yeah, it also can be used for military options. So this is what we call a dual use technology. And the question right now is, how do we want to use space in future? Yeah, and as we already know, or maybe heard, there are international treaties dictating that there should be no active militarization. That's right. But however, in the days, as we already heard, when the agreements were negotiated, the technical possibilities were very small, and meanwhile the situation changed. And as we, I guess, further colonize space, which to my mind really will take place, we will therefore require new regulations, because the old regulations we made, for example, in the 1960s and 1970s, are not really adequate to the technology and the huge amount of actors we need to deal or have to deal right now in the space with. And so I guess one of the most interesting questions in this case is how dual use technology is really controlled, and how shall we deal with the question of further militarization in space? Because it is not just, as we already said, it's not just research and commercial things. It's also military, because most of the states, especially the big states, know that they have a possibility and know that treaties are not really up to the situation that we can use technology for this. And I hope that we will take this in mind when further discussing today. And yeah, found it quite interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Moritz, and thanks for drawing out that distinction between the dual use of space technology for military as well as civil purposes. If I may ask a small follow-up question there, that do you think that there is, given that there's a huge potential for military usage of the space, do you think that space is going to be again a battleground between nations? Or do you think that it poses opportunities for greater collaboration?
Yeah, I guess I read yesterday. I read an article where it was said that it's cooperation and competition, and to my mind, and with regard to the fact that launching systems and orbiters and all the technique used in space is quite expensive. To my mind, I guess we need to cooperate in space. Yeah, because otherwise, especially for nations, it is not really, they can't really offend these huge amounts of money, yeah, to act by their own in space. But on the other side, there is a possibility. For example, last year, I guess, or 2 years ago, Russia showed that they have satellites, or that they can use satellites to destroy other objects in space. So actually, they use it for, yeah, keeping waste small. Yeah, but on the other side, for example, the US said, "Oh my God, this is a vehicle they could also use to destroy, for example, our satellites or orbiters." So I don't know whether there is, whether we really need to be frightened of an arms race in outer space, but there is the fact that technology could used for this, and that we need to find some kind of international regulation, and to the fact that it's still quite expensive, and we already have cooperation in military ways also between US and Russia, for example, between Russia and China, or China and the US, or the whole NATO states in Europe, for example. I guess cooperation is possible, but it is then possible when states have the feeling that they don't have any disadvantage on the cooperation. And I guess this are things we need to figure out in future. States need to figure out in future, when talking about arms in space and cooperation of military usages of whatever, of technology in space.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Moritz. And before we move to Himaki, I know that Mohit wants to add something on this. So Mohit, if you could come in with a quick comment.
Thanks, Arpit. And my comment will be very quick, because we've seen the use of technology, use of space since Cold War. If you talk about the Gulf War, there was 1990s. There was the first space war that was quoted as the first space war, and how weapons have been used with, embedded with GPS technologies, or countries spying on each other with the use of, like, satellites, etc. So there has been certain militarization to this aspect here. But what we're seeing with this limited ban treaty that took place, which talks about how you cannot really test nuclear weapons in outer space, in underground, underwater, etc. So there have been steps that have been taken, seeing how it could have been used as military purposes in the past. And then countries and the UN are also trying to come up with different ways to ensure that that doesn't happen. So from that perspective, as we say that there's an increased scope of them collaborating on more civil issues, there is a potential of a space war that could potentially happen. But currently, like, everybody's aware of it, because it's not something new, and nobody will be surprised to see if that comes, because it's an uncharted territory. And there are different aspects, which includes the hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Mohit.
Sorry, yeah. So I'm saying there's different aspects to it as well, which includes space debris, which impacts the sustainability aspect. So it's there, but currently it's controlled, but we don't know what holds in the future. And this happening is also a possibility, apart from the civic use of space and its resources.
I mean, just a quick add-on before we go to Himaki. Don't you think that a lot of technology anyway, or a lot of things, institutions, technology that we use in the civic space, they emerge from the military space? I mean, there are a lot of arguments which say that industrialization in itself was triggered because nations wanted to innovate militarily for the great power competition that was brewing in the 18th, 19th century. We know that the internet was first developed for military use, and it was only later when it was commercialized for public use. So a lot of things, a lot of researchers say that technology transfer, or that impulse for progress or technology, can be traced to military. So I'm not sure whether in real life the distinction between the military sphere and the civic sphere is that, is set in stone, or is that, a perforated sort of a line. So yeah, okay, over to Himaki now.
Hi, thank you so much, Alfred. First of all, I mean, we have made a great advancement in human civilization, right? We started off from hunting to industrialization to the nuclear age, and now we've entered the uncertain realm, which is space age at the moment. And the reason we went to the space age is for a simple reason. Stephen Hawking had put up very eloquently that when we are in a crisis, we tend to colonize. And now we don't have a new world. We don't have any utopia around the corner. So where do we go? We're looking up. And now every individual, every civilian, every military organization, every developing country is so dependent on, space-based technology as highlighted by Mohit, Moritz, and Arundhati. So it is very imperative for, policy makers, legislators, and other stakeholders involved in the private players for them to be, having a certain understanding or space literacy or how to build these policies. And as policymakers, I guess they tend to make policies which is far-sighted. And we, even though we made the man reach space without we had any legal mechanism, any legal framework. So it is so important to be building policies around space and to be able to. And at the moment, space is congested. It's competitive, right? And it is even more than required to be having these policies. And to be able to make these policies, it is very important to be able to harness international cooperation. I mean, I guess without that, we won't be able to strive harder, or we won't be able to see a better human civilization. And adding to Moritz's military point, if and to like your question, Alfred, if we are going to be reaching a point of space war, maybe yes, because if you look at US at the moment, their Department of Defense actually defined that the domain of space is a war fighting domain now, and they have a space force at the moment, right? So there is a possibility that there might be a space force. So we need to be on our foot, and I need to be thinking far ahead how to avoid that situation completely. So I guess the conversation around space policy, space diplomacy is just so significant. And at the same time, we need to make sure we don't exploit the resources up there. That's the conversation around sustainability of space is so important at the moment. So, yeah.
And it's a complex conversation because, the question again is that are we going to replicate the same sort of mental models, right? From fighting with sticks and stones to fighting in the space, or is space going to present us some opportunities to cooperate? Because as Himaki, you and I, we were discussing a couple of days back that space is, it's an infinite game. It can, unlike the Earth, which has limited resources, for which you typically tend to fall into a Nash equilibrium, into a prisoner's dilemma Nash equilibrium. The space could be more of a cooperative stag hunt sort of a game where there are more payoffs for cooperation rather than competition. But as you rightly point out, we might see a world where we are again, back to our same old story. We have watched that movie enough times, so we might be in Star Wars. Who knows? But thank you for bringing that aspect. I'd like to invite Moshmi to shed some light on that, on this discussion.
Thanks, Alfred.
By the way, I have to tell you, they do serve some tea in the space, if you can see my. Sorry, over to you, Moshmi.
Sorry, yeah, circling back to the initial question of, why space policy is important, I personally think that it's high time that we talk about space policy and especially sustainability on a large scale, because like Himaki kind of echoed, the interest in space, existed long before we even had the technology to get there. And humans have always had existential questions like, why are we here and where we come from? So we started looking up at the sky to get these answers, right? And right from the 6th century with Greek philosophers like Thales or Aristotle, who started exploring the space above, and eventually, a mathematician from Poland, Nicholas Copernicus.
Copernicus.
Yeah. telling us that the sun is the center of the universe, even though some people might still deny that, but that's another conversation. So I think space curiosity has always existed since consciousness, dating back to the 6th century. And slowly after that, we moved on to this epic fascination with human flights in the form of hot air balloons and airplanes, because we wanted to fly amongst the stars. And we know that fighter planes especially became very important during World War One. So once we achieved that, we realized that there's still uncharted territory further above that we could get to. But like Mohit, I think, mentioned, after the race to space and the moon relay episode that happened between US and USSR in the Cold War era, I think the amount of lives lost due to the experiments that were held then, and the scale of government funding that was rooted in space exploration, that was highly questioned by the masses, because the economy then was already breaking. And I think that was a big hiccup that shed a lot of negative light towards space exploration, and maybe the conversation of a proper policy strayed because of it, even though the limited, I think, legal framework that exists today is due to that episode, ironically. But the reality of the matter is that space exploration has become a necessity. And like Mohit mentioned, we have so many technologies, right, from like ultrasound scanners and TV transmissions. So we know that the space exploration future is kind of inevitable. And the question before us today is, how are we going to regulate it, right? I mean, it's almost shocking to know that this field has been evolving over decades without proper legal framework around it. And I think one of the reasons for that maybe is because it's one of the rare remaining fields where we still believe experts, right? Because we don't have anybody else to turn to except for them. And the truth is that creating a detailed space policy is important for every individual, because we more or less know what's out there, but and that it has a huge impact in our daily lives now, both socially and economically. But the rising challenge is how we're going to navigate it as citizens of the earth, because we don't always know what we're up against in outer space. And actually like to expand on the international cooperation legal framework as well, but maybe a little later.
Sure. I think that's probably going to be one of the first things that we should talk about, right when we jump into our discussion session. But I think you have raised, some very important points, and I have to thank you for tracing the sort of history for us, where you started with how some philosophers, they talked about looking up to find things, and how then the US and the USSR started exploring the space. I'm just wondering if somebody on the panel, and I'm sure this question is there in some of our audience's mind as well, that from what I personally know, it was, it's a known fact that it was the USSR indeed that sent the first living creature into outer space.
Laika.
Yeah, Laika. But where did and when did and why did countries start thinking that, okay, let's start sending stuff up there in the outer space, and what were their motivations? I can probably, if I were to guess, I'd say there were some security concerns, but then, we all hear that there was this arms race between the US and the USSR for reaching the space, but was it just for pure bragging rights? Was it for, some real pragmatic purposes? Does anybody have any knowledge on that?
I just wanted to add to that.
Sure, Himaki.
So we know the reason Soviets sent the first satellite is for the simple reason for surveillance technology. They wanted to survey and for reconnaissance purposes over USA, right? And that's why when they realized that there was a question about, okay, we can do this. What else is out there? We can do much more. And that's when USA felt a little, like they were at a disadvantage, and USA being USA because they wanted to far ahead in the space. They also started sending satellites, and that's when the space war became not space war. The competition began as to who can do better, and there was this an advancement in technological innovation. Right, it suddenly from fighting just in the atmosphere, we're thinking far way beyond. And that's where it started. There is much more out there which we can explore. And irony being when they realized that when the outer space treaty was signed between the Soviet Union and USA, there was one. It's like a fun trivia. It states that it is space exploration is only for peaceful purposes, but space exploration, the inception started off because of military uses. So there's this little loophole out there. So yeah, it's just really
Well,
fun.
it's for peaceful military purposes,
Yeah.
probably. But thank you for being the space historian over here for us, Himaki. But before we open it out to the discussion, last but not least, I'd like to open it up to Arif. Arif, what do you think about the importance of space technology, of cooperation and sustainability in the space, and what do you really mean by it?
Thank you, Arpit, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone, wherever you are. It gives me great pleasure, to discuss about this topic today in this forum. So before I start, let me just take a step back, and just pose an existential or a philosophical, point of view here. For example, right in 2002, I guess, the former US Secretary of Defense, Mr. Donald Rumsfeld, he had a quote to a reply, when he was asked about Iraq's status of weapons of mass destruction. So he quoted something like that. We know that there are known knowns, there are things that we know exist, and there are known unknowns, things we know that, we don't know. We know that there are things we don't know. And the last but not the least is the unknown unknowns. Like there are things we don't know. So and this latter category of items or things or policies, whatever we can digress upon, this is the most difficult to tackle. So what I see as an analogy to policy, diplomacy, or sustainability in outer space is I can compare to this concept of unknown. And surprisingly or interestingly, unknown term was not used by Donald Rumsfeld for the first time. It originated much before, in the realms of philosophy. And it happened that he heard of this term from a data scientist in NASA. So that's how he use this word to describe about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So I mean, we already have discussed a lot of policy, technology, and trivia from the esteemed panelists here. So what I believe is that the concept of space travel is because of the infiniteness of the human mind to explore beyond the unknown. So that's why we go centuries beyond and behind to think about how we could go into space exploration. But the exact rules of the law, or maybe guidelines, were probably drafted 50 years back, right, when we had the space race, the Cold War between former Soviet Union and the US. And then right now we have, as Mohit mentioned, more than 100 countries who are developing countries as well, who are in this space race to extract something valuable for their countries, right, be it economic or military or sort of international prestige. So I'd also like to stress upon the rationale as to why 50 years back the US and the USSR post the World War, right, during the start of the Cold War, they wanted to go into a sort of space race. That's because primarily three categories as per the theory, which is for the protection of the national security, and for scientific advancement, and also for prestige, which matters most for international leadership, because that time it was a two sort of world, right? The US and the communist Russia, USSR, former Russia. And then afterwards, as the decades progressed, the rational focus shifted, towards direction. For example, we have the military expertise, for example, DARPA in US, which was developed the precursor of the internet, as we spoke about, the ARPANET. And then we also have, space commercialization, which even though we think that Elon Musk says SpaceX is a recent collaboration with NASA, is a private public partnership, but even then space commercialization actually started from before. I mean, though it has been in nowadays. So it has started, then, because after we have this sort of, and also, space technologies, they also can be used in utilization of achieving of UN's sustainable development goals. For example, we can use to predict, climate shift, etc., and all those, from the satellite. For example, Galileo, which is the only satellite system owned by civilian agency, for example, the European Union. Uh, they have a mandate that probably, it will adhere to around 13 or 17 SDGs of UN. So that's, from a policy point of view, we have different shifts, right? From the space age to right now, and where we have commercial activities like, targeting for mining on Mars, terraforming. We have ethical, viewpoints behind that, as well as, space tourism, etc., which might come up probably in the next decade or so. And that's from a point of view from policy. And I can also talk a little bit about, the start the discussion for sustainability. For example, in sustainability, when you talk about outer space, we think about sustainability of, landform or terrain in outer space. But what I believe is that if we take a step back, sustainability starts from, below the Kármán line. For example, the Kármán line, distinguishes space from art, right? So when we extract metals or rare earth elements for fuel and for, construction of space equipment, we also need to see sustainability on art itself, right? From launch of a satellite or a space object to the operations at space to the safe re-entry, we also need to look at sustainability. For example, I think in 1978, there was a legal case between Canada and USSR, where, owing to an entry of a space vehicle of USSR, there was, a sort of nuclear radiation fallout, when the space debris got disintegrated, right? So we also have to look at, from extraction of, elements in art to terraforming. So there are a lot of, it's infinite, right, space. So there are a lot of policies we can develop on. Thank you.
Challenges, policies, opportunities, all are infinite, as you rightly said, in the space realm. I'd like to discuss about the current state of the art in terms of what are the policies, treaties in place. And I know that Moshmi has to shed some light upon that. But then before that, I'd like to bring in Mohit real quick, because as Mohit has told us, he has some very interesting trivia. So trivia is important in this particular case. So Mohit, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Arpit, for fitting me in. And I love trivia. Like, I love to be part of quizzes. So it's a great day to have this conversation around this this topic today, because just last year on December 20th, 2019, President Donald J. Trump signed and declared the Space Force as the sixth branch of military in the US. So I just wanted to share that because, that happened just literally on this day when he signed that bill, and today we are discussing about this. So I mean, the way things are progressing, and now potentially based on after that the Steve Carell's Netflix show on Space Force as a mockery to this whole thing that came out, and there's so much is happening at such a fast pace. The importance of space exploration in terms of how countries would use in its benefit or towards a negative sense is so important for us. And that's just what I wanted to share. Over to you, Moshmi.
No, absolutely. And another thing, what I read in the news is that now people serving in the space agency in the US have been named as the guardians, from what I gather. And that has been decided only a couple of days back.
No, that's true, because I mean, just from the guardian's perspective, and also like when we're talking about technology, we also talk about the employment, right? So if you go to Blue Origin's website, Blue Origins is the private Jeff Bezos's firm, who like just like Elon Musk has SpaceX, Jeff Bezos has Blue Origin. You will see hundreds of job postings that are there for engineers who would want to pursue a career in space technology. The Canada Ministry has this entire page on how they're flaunting what can be done with when they have people over who are interested into this. So the fact that this leads to not just the getting the resources part, but generating so much employment and addition to the economy, which UK highlighted in their report, in their space report last year as well. So it says that it has a lot of potential. But again, the question is, can this potential be used with collaboration and cooperation for some positive use, or it might go in a direction which is unthinkable and has additional unintended consequences to it?
Absolutely. And I think that's the great question, that are we going to see cooperation in the space, or is it going to be a lot more competition for resources? Because in a limited sense, yes, we can say that space is infinite, but then once you've found a chunk of a particular mineral, that mineral for you, given the technology, given the capacity and the money needed to exploit that, is finite at that point of time. So that again triggers competition. Moritz, I know that you mentioned something in the chat box here, that something was introduced by NATO as a new topic to nuclear proliferation. So can you just shed some light on that, please?
Yeah, it was just to add to what Mohit said, that also next to the US, also the NATO introduced space as one of the new head topics in their agenda, and that they I guess now for 1 year. So it was slightly after Donald Trump introduced it or set it up for the United States strategy. So what we can see from this is that space is of particular concern, not just for the big space foreign nations. It's also of concern for member states, for example, of alliances. So and cooperating as well, yeah, in this topic. And what I just wanted to say in this way is, so it is on the military side, it is extremely important for lots of quite wealthy states around the world. And what we can see from this is that it will become that important in future, because I guess that alliances like the NATO will force more cooperation or more work on this topic in the next years. Yeah, and I just wanted to add it. But one point to cooperation in space. What I found quite interesting is that the problem is, above all, that states promise or sign a lot, but some don't necessarily stick to it. This also has to do with, and that's what I wanted to say, this also has to do with how much pressure states can exert on each other. Yeah, so if we really want to cooperate, what will you give me for that? Yeah, and I guess this is something which we need to take in mind, because especially, for example, when looking in the competition between China, the US, and Russia in space, yeah, you will see that we have that space is not it's not foremost the most important topic for them. But if you really want to find some cooperation, for example, between Russia and the US, you need first of all to think about what is or states will think, what is my advantage of this cooperation, and what can I give the other state for a cooperation, you know? And to that, what you can give another state is, I guess, most things you can give another state is our issues, which are economic issues or whatever else, yeah. But for example, when you look to Russia and the militarization of space, for example, yeah, Russia currently has such a big lead in one of the most important fields of defense, like nuclear
proliferation,
yeah, that it is already difficult to conduct further negotiation in this field of disarmament on Earth. And how then are offenses in space to be addressed? You know, and that's what I think is of particular importance, because I guess cooperation in research will be easy, maybe, but in other fields, as Mohit, for example, pointed out, where we're dealing with resources and also with influence in space, it will be quite hard.
I think that is the kind of grand challenge that the humanity faces, because and the challenge being that how do you bring about cooperation without or enforcement, or in scarcity of the quid pro quo, that what can I benefit from and what can you give. And uh, with the United Nations turning 75, and with all of this UN 75 celebrations going on, there's also been a lot of criticism of the UN system, that it has not been able to bring about cooperation on many facets. I think sometimes that criticism could be, you know, a bit more than what is justified or warranted, but then still we see that agreements which are non-enforceable are hardly finding any progress across the world. And I believe that before we step into space, we should solve for this grand challenge for humanity before things get out of hand. So with that, I know that Arundhati has a remark to make, and then right after Arundhati, I'd like to go to Moshmi to understand what are the current states of regulation, and what are the current treaties that we have uh, for the space across the world. So Arundhati, I'd like to bring you in first. Aditi, you might want to unmute Arundhati.
Thanks, Aditi. So actually, before we moved on to the legal framework, I also remembered a trivia. And since we were talking about the good things of space exploration, and then Arif brought in the sustainability point. So I was also reading recently that Venus used to be a planet which was like habitable, but because of climate change, it got into a state that it's now uninhabitable. And we know that we are also going to explore Venus further. So I think it's actually, if anything, it could help us also, to study and to reason, analyze what can we do to make ourselves better as a collective humanity and as a planet. So yeah, that way space exploration.
That's a nice
also
trivia. I didn't know about Venus at all, that it was once a place where we could live and chill. Thank you. Thank you, Arundhati. And now over to Moshmi. Moshmi, I know that you mentioned that there are certain things which are there in the current treaties and certain things that are desirable. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So, thanks, Arpit. Some really good points made by the other fellows and some really good trivia. But when we talk about cooperation, I think I'm a huge cynic, right? So I don't think optimistically, and I'm not totally sure about what the future of cooperation between countries will look like, because before that, I'd like to take a step back and discuss the existing challenges that probably hinder international cooperation. So the Outer Space Treaty is basically the Magna Carta in space law, and it provides, I think Himaki also touched upon this, and it provides a general framework basically for regulation of space related activities. So how it was enforced is important to reflect upon right now for some context. So talks on preserving outer space for peaceful purposes basically began in the late 1950s at the UN, and proposals were submitted on reserving space exclusively for peaceful and scientific purposes. But the Soviet Union rejected these efforts because it was preparing to launch the world's first satellite and test its intercontinental ballistic missile. And this was a time when tensions were at an all-time high between US and the USSR. However, they eventually, worked out a draft in cooperation with the US, and the Outer Space Treaty was finally enforced in 1967. And I think as of June 2020, there are 110 countries parties to the treaty. But the hallmark of the Outer Space Treaty is that it isn't too detailed. So the important thing to probably note is that the treaty was never intended to be comprehensive in the first place, because the Cold War was in full swing at the time, and secondly, because space travel was in its infancy then, and this agreement was just meant to address issues that could arise as space technology advance gradually. So it is somewhat flexible in its interpretation today, but at the same time, it's also very limited. And fast forwarding to today, I think this treaty gives rise to two very important challenges that we touched upon already when it comes to international cooperation. The first being weaponization. So the treaty only, as we know, banned weapons of mass destruction, but that is difficult to ensure military security of outer space because some kind of weapons are still allowed, as we know, and space hasn't completely been free of weaponization. But interesting thing about that is I think since 2002 China and Russia have been committed to kind of negotiating a convention prohibiting all weaponization in outer space. So in 2008, China and Russia proposed a draft in the Conference of Disarmament, which prohibited any kind of weaponization in outer space, and it also prohibits use of force completely. But this draft is still in the works because tensions are still high between the back and forth that goes on in US and Russia in this field. And basically at the first committee session in October of 2018, there were 4 resolutions passed involving outer space security, which was adopted by which was basically rejected by the United States. They voted no on all 4 of the resolutions. But if this treaty was to be worked out by the powerful states, the 3 powerful states that we know of, China, Russia, and US, I think the tensions may slightly decrease and cooperation may increase. But having said that, I'm not hopeful about its success because a number of countries are already developing new military technologies in space. France, for example, is working on laser beams that could dazzle another country's satellite, preventing it from taking pictures of classified targets. And North Korea, I think, is studying jammed radio frequency signals, I think, sent to or from a satellite. And I know Iran is also devising cyber attacks that could interfere with satellite systems. So yeah, I think the 3 states, US, Russia, and China, if at all they make a movement, a positive movement in this field, maybe we could see some kind of cooperation in the future. But just summing up, my second challenge that I think would increase international cooperation is land grabs. So the Outer Space Treaty, initially it established that all nations should have free access to space and that exploitation of the cosmos should be a peaceful enterprise, something that Himaki was talking about. And such exploration basically was to be for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. So that did set up the importance for international cooperation in the realm of space travel. But immediately after creating this fair use of space, the treaty makes one very important caveat, which is space and celestial bodies cannot be appropriated by a nation, which basically means a country can't claim moon as its own, for instance. And the motivation here was to prevent space land grabs. But as we are seeing in recent years, space law experts have also been debating its interpretation more and more, the treaty's interpretation more and more. And companies express this infinite interest in mining space objects for resources. And basically this potentially leads to the conversation of privatization in space and how that will look like. But yeah, I think to sum up, if we can overcome these 2 particular challenges of land grabs and weaponization, then we might have a better idea about how international cooperation will look like between states.
Well, thank you so much, Moshmi, for that detailed analysis. I think
I researched a lot.
I'm feeling certainly quite enlightened after hearing your analysis of what space treaties have been and how they're shaping. I know Himaki has to make a point, but before that, let me just say a couple of things. That I think you've opened 2 very important avenues for discussion, and without which I don't think that today's conversation would be complete. One is the issue of privatization of space exploration. I'd like to take some time and invite the panel to discuss over that. And the other is about the asymmetric access to space or asymmetric capabilities that the nations are developing. As you said, that China, Russia, and the US are the major players, but then there are other countries which are emerging. Mohit had given us the data that 100 countries have space missions already, so space agencies already. So what would happen to countries which are latecomers in this game? So for example, in industrialization, there were countries which were early movers and they were able to reap certain benefits and then impose certain restrictions on the other countries. Uh, are we likely to see that over here? So I'd like to discuss that. But then before getting into that, I'd like to go to Himaki. And just one aside before we go to Himaki is that we have about half an hour left. So the chat box is open. I'd invite people in the audience to start thinking about questions or comments and post that as we discuss. But over to you, Himaki.
Um, Thanks, Arpit. Moshmi actually made really great points, and I wanted to make some points corresponding to that. Is that we all know that Outer Space Treaty is very archaic, and while it was being drafted, there were a lot of things which were left out. They never took into account as to what happens if space satellites collide together and induce more space debris. The definition of space is not, there is no concrete definition of space. I mean, there are so many things. Is it the Earth's atmosphere? Is it in the outer orbit? Or is it, the edge of outer space? And then there is no, like you mentioned, privatization. So there is no, like policy pertaining to what are the functions of different stakeholders. Are privatization players allowed or not? And the Outer Space Treaty actually states that there is limited privatization, but the USA recently, took out a policy that there's going to be full commercial usage and commercialization of natural resources in the outer space and can be exploited by its citizens. So now, the question,
Wow.
like what you mentioned, as to do early players get like a far ahead in the race? I think they do, because that's what happened in the nuclear age, right? The guys, they made sure they were early in the stage, and they were able to make progress in the nuclear treatment, and the other countries had to sign the energy, like, okay, fine, we are just going to use the nuclear power. So I think that's what the other countries are doing. Like, you have a very interesting treaty called the Moon Treaty, where you have about 7 countries, including India, where they have said that all the resources on Moon are supposed to be used for peaceful coexistence of only these countries and for the betterment of the mankind. And the interesting part is China, USA, Australia, and Russia are not part of the treaty. For the
Oh,
simple
wow.
reason, we want to go exploit the resources. And that's why there's been a push by the Indian government that we need to not be a part of the Moon Treaty. So you're already seeing a difference in the diplomacy sector, right? That they're the top key players are ready to go and exploit for their betterment, or for their own betterment of their own country. So yeah, I think. And when it comes to the talk about privatization, I guess it is very important to be able to denote what exactly would be their specific function into this, because it can go a lot of other ways, because we know that there are natural resources which are depleting here. And the next alternative is asteroid mining. I mean, they are actually looking at avenues about how they can get out, because our mobile phones are made of 3 digital components which are dying and depleting, and they're looking for those resources on the asteroid. And the only way to go about it is to include a free enterprise economy into this whole space dialogue. So yeah, you already have the 3 main players. You have Richard Branson, you have Elon Musk, and you have Jeff Bezos are re-entering, and you never know, maybe the Ambanis might be the next one entering this conversation.
Who knows? Who
You on
knows?
you in the space. So yeah.
No, thank you for bringing some of these aspects, such as the Moon Treaty. I did not know about that. But also, I mean, to draw a parallel to what you said, Himaki, that you were saying that indeed, just like the nuclear age, where some of the countries which were early movers, they started, after they had exploited the nuclear resource to their heart's will. The newer players, and in fact, India faced a lot of challenge in coming up with its own nuclear capability, and there were sanctions and whatnot. And obviously now new countries who want to join the nuclear club are finding it more and more costlier and prohibitive to develop nuclear technology. But do you think that's the nature of the game? How about cyber? Because there were countries that were early movers, certainly in the cyber age, But then now you see late adopters such as India, such as other countries in Africa really seeing a boom and really exploiting the potential of the cyber technology uh, to their own advantage. Yes, I can grant you the fact that you could argue that the early movers, they have all of the cloud storage capacity, they have all of that, and now with the data localization demands that India etc are placing, they are seeing a pushback from American companies, because the costs go up when you insist on data localization. So but do you think that cyber maybe was a space where the early adopter advantage did not prove to be prohibitive for the late adopters?
I kind of agree to that. And I guess when it came to cyber, a lot of countries didn't follow a very interesting strategy, which is like the proactive preventive strategy, right? But when it came to
Mm-hmm.
nuclear and space, they were like, okay, we want to make sure everybody gets the piece of the cake, but we want to be the first one as well. And if anyone comes at us, and we will make sure we attack them. So I think with cyber that didn't happen, but I think space, cyber was not such an uncertain realm, but space there is infinite possibilities what can be done. And I guess
Mm-hmm.
that's why it is very important for the countries to be ahead of the game, and at the same time limit the other countries to be part of this game. So I guess it is very imperative about how diplomacy comes into question, how UN, do we have it, do we soon, are we going to soon have an interplanetary UN commission? Maybe, maybe not. Are we going to be having again the same five countries vetoing the other countries? Maybe, maybe not. So I think these are those gray spaces we need to be addressing while having these conversations, and to make sure that these resources again don't fall into the hands of only the first few people. And then again, you see the rise of non-state actors and terrorist activities. You don't want to replicate what's happening on Earth right there in space, right?
No, and even on the economic side, I want to bring Mohit in, but then just one last point from my side is that not only militarily, but even on the economic side, we've seen the same story play out during the Industrial Revolution, where certain countries industrialized ahead of the others, and then they lay waste the environment to a degree that any other country industrializing would jeopardize the whole survival of the human race. So, so the countries which were late mover had a prohibitive disadvantage, which could again happen in the space age if enough information about the responsible use of outer space is not shared at parity with other nations which have not entered the space age or championed the space technologies per se. But with that, over to Mohit.
Yeah, so I have a slightly different point of view when it comes to this, where I feel that, like here, when you enter space, you add like a complexity of many more dimensions that exist there, which don't exist right here. And this the fact that they're there, it increases the complexity to many more. And I believe that what happened on Earth, or what happens on Earth, is not replicable to what might happen out there in space. For example, New Zealand has and it also depends on what you are aiming for. So in Moon Treaty, as I heard from my colleagues, it might be a situation which it could mean that certain important players are a part of the ecosystem who want to access to resources before anybody else. But then how do you even get there, right? So for example, let's take New Zealand example. They have outdone the UK in the creation of small satellites in collaboration with the US to launch it in the outer space. Okay, so they had used like some technologies from a company based out of California, and helped them to build smaller satellites, which they're spending in the outer space in the first orbit, is what they say here. So what I feel from that example, and many more coming out as well, that it really, to go there to explore something which is so complex out there, you need a certain kind of hand holding in terms of technology, in terms of getting things out from different resources, and in terms of the money, infrastructure, and different aspects which will help you go there. And no country in its isolation is at its place where they can say that we can do it by ourselves, and we have figured it out, right? So just from the complexity perspective, I feel that it's going to be more collaborative. It's going to be much more in terms of, okay, how can we help you, or how can I take help from you to get to somewhere, because this is what we are good at, this is what you are good at, let's collaborate and see what we can get together back. So that's what I think personally. It may be quite naive in terms of like the opinion or the perspective, but looking, I mean, I feel the complexity is enough for everybody to scare everybody and say that, okay, we'll figure it out by ourselves.
No, absolutely, Mohit, and thank you for bringing this wave of optimism after the skepticism triggered in by the previous panelists. But I completely agree, because I think it's also human nature that when we are exploring things that we absolutely have no clue about, a lot of times it just makes rational sense, not out of altruism. It just makes rational sense to collaborate and maximize rather than maximize individually. So I can see that logic playing out very well. Uh,
Sorry, just to add again, like the last point here, which also adds a bit of trivia here, is not just outer space in terms of what we're going to use with respect to technologies in collaboration with what's out there. If you talk about, and if you zoom in to the idea of the logos, right? The logos of all the international space agencies has something called as a chevron vector, which is that red sign with like this triangle, which is common across most of the countries who are designing or has a space agency. So in solidarity of like what's there and how they want to explore that, they've kind of adhered to this and said in one way or the other, they're going to put that as part of their logo for their own country, where we've seen a lot of divide happening on so many different fronts. But space could be an anomaly, and it might define collaboration in a very different way for us.
Thank you for another piece of very interesting trivia for us, Mohit. In fact, what you are saying also makes me think about the Arctic Circle, because space is a faraway matter, but then even in the Arctic, you see a lot of countries, instead of just rabid competition, which now a lot of strategic thinkers think that will happen in the future, especially for the North Pole. But then in the Arctic Circle, so far, we've seen a lot more collaboration than competition, and even in Antarctica. And these have been fairly uncharted territories for humankind. So I think there is some evidence that points to the fact that when you're in a newer domain, countries, they tend to cooperate rather than compete with each other. All right, so again, if we have no questions from the audience, then we're going to utilize another 10 minutes to just build on this discussion. And my question again is on the aspect of privatization of space technology, of space exploration. As it has been pointed out by our panelists already, that the United States has allowed its citizens to explore the space privately, not only through the government channel. I believe one of our panelists in our previous discussion a couple of days back also pointed out that, if I'm not wrong, India has also allowed private space exploration. What are the ramifications of this? How does it change, or what does it mean? What is the significance of allowing the private sector to explore the space? Anybody has some views on that?
Can I add a bit to this?
Sure, Arif, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just, to the point of privatization, I would just like to draw an analogy between, the big tech companies, right? And and sort of, the self-regulatory nature of the big tech companies, and to build on the point of Moshimi, I think, who had explained about outer space treaty, I'd just like to, draw a linkage on that. For example, I think recently, probably, if not this year, probably I think a couple of months ago or probably last year, Elon Musk, right? He had mentioned about some laws which which form a sort of a corollary to the Outer Space Treaty. For example, he was telling that, you know, the Outer Space Treaty would probably be valid, you know, if not legally binding, would probably be valid for, you know, spatial items like items in space like moon or asteroids. But when he thinks of colonizing Mars, the principles of outer space theory would not probably be valid for Mars. So that's his point of view. But then there have been a lot of, you know, criticism on the fact, because space is actually non-appropriation. Mars is also a part of space, so that Elon Musk cannot make his own, you know, laws on that. So when we talk about privatization, right? So we can think that if let's say Virgin Galactic, right, or let's say SpaceX or Blue, what do you call, Origin, right, which is Jeff Bezos, what we call a company. So when they, you know, they travel to these aspects of, you know, the space like Mars, and then start to build their own colonies, would they be, you know, forming rules like the big tech companies, which have come under heavy criticism in as
That's an
like
interesting
for
aspect.
example, if you see internet law, right? And let's say, you know, I'm not against a particular corporate, but there have been, you know, criticisms of the labor laws of different, you know, e-commerce companies or different companies around the world. If they
Or
make
even the
corporate,
data sharing and privacy laws.
yes, data sharing, privacy laws, and also, you know, labor regulations. For example, the minimum wage, right? Some of the companies that don't pay the minimum wage, and they have come under heavy criticism. So if they form a colony, and if the privatization happens, if they supersede the law of US, let's say SpaceX is US, and as per Outer Space Treaty, USA is responsible for SpaceX's actions in space. But if
Yeah.
it's superseded by a private company, and where do we draw the line between the rights of the people there? For example, the people who are, let's say, living in a colony outside, would they be treated as per the company's laws or as per the law of the, you know, land? So there are a lot of things to ponder about from, you know, humanitarian perspective, and, you know, from a sort of an ethical perspective as well. So just wanted to draw a point on
Now,
that.
interesting point, because what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that if, let's say, company X or SpaceX colonizes Mars, then it can have its employees who are working on Mars be living on much lower than minimum wage, and nobody can do a damn thing about that,
Yeah,
right?
that could be one of the repercussions.
I think when you were saying this, another aspect occurred to me, was that just like the internet, it's not governed by a particular country, and the internet is something that it's a technology of the post Westphalian state order, and we are still living in a Westphalian state world, but then it's a technology which you know transfers state boundaries like nothing else. So uh, that technology is not well regulated by any single body, or is not perfectly regulated by any single body. And as a result, you see these tech giants almost creating an oligopoly in that market. We saw, for example, in some of the senatorial hearings a couple of months back, as to how some companies are being forcefully acquired by some of these tech giants. You could perhaps also see that in the space industry, with some of these big firms now way ahead, being way ahead of the game than the others. And then when they start defining the laws of the game, with tech companies, you could have problems of acquisition, unfair acquisitions, or data privacy issues. With space companies, it could be security breaches, or who knows what. So I think that also would be a great challenge.
Can I just add one tiny little point, an interesting point?
Sure.
When the private players are kind of looking into other aspects, is because you'll be sending humans out in outer space. There are more. You need to you need to take care of the humans more. Right? You need to have proper mechanism in taking care of them. So they're kind of trying to automate this whole process. So there is a possibility to be are we going to have a robotics right commission in the next 20 years? You never know. I mean, that could be an interesting technique. We don't really have that. So yeah, they're trying to automate things because they don't want to take the onus of burden of humans on themselves. But maybe you will have people fighting for the rights of the robots. So I just wanted to put it there.
Yeah, and
never know.
If I may,
we first need to take care of the animals before the robots. But over to you, Mohit.
No. Very interesting point, Himaki. So I was going to say that, okay, humans colonizing the Mars is again something, it's a big if. It's something that we haven't seen across as at this point in time, but there's something that we're currently sure of that happens, which in this regard is really important for us to discuss in terms specifically from the matters of sustainability and ownership here, which is this cause of space debris. Right. So with privatization up on the rise, we see that multiple players are trying different things, testing different aspects with regards to space exploration, and which means that there could be certain destruction or certain kind of incidents which may cause a lot of space debris to happen outside the space, which nobody really wants to claim and say that, okay, we caused this, right? So that's a more important aspect, because currently we're still in the if stage of colonization on a certain planet. But who takes responsibility of the space debris that they are causing? Is it the company which is privatized, or is it the country where the company belongs? And that's a more important concern, because if countries are signing up their space policies and saying that we encourage privatization, are they interested in taking the blame and saying that we are the ones who are causing that space debris, and we'll take charge of that, and we'll keep ourselves accountable to all of that? So
yeah, I mean, we are still struggling with the laws of the seas, right? And trying to fix accountability for the companies and polluting the seas. I wonder how it's going to play out in the space. I really do also think, while you was talking about that, is that we do not still know about the ramifications of sending out waste to the outer space, because after ages and ages, we've finally come to a realization that within the earth, everything is interconnected. We are living in an interconnected ecosystem, wherein if you pollute over here, it's going to have an effect somewhere else, and if somebody pollutes over there, it's going to have an effect on you. I don't think we have come to that realization about the space. I would say that it's again an unknown. We don't know whether if we pollute or if we send waste out to the space, is that somewhere going to be impacting us in the longer run? We don't know. So I think there's also a question of developing that understanding.
That's a brilliant point. And the first step is just like tracking who that entity is, right? So at least I don't know if my understanding of space technology is out there correct, in terms of if because there's so much money and involvement of space stations, as we've discussed, is involved. If you send something out there, if your country is sending something there, it's out there, like satellites can catch that, different countries would know. So that accountability kind of exists, based on what my understanding is, that to figure out what is that thing that's coming out of the earth, which country does it belong to, and who can be left accountable to if that system crashes and the debris is out there, and if that rocket might come hitting on some part of the world in some way, like who is held to be accountable. I think that we are kind of settled. I don't know if there's something that's completely new which I don't know about. So I think it's a process, as we all know, and if you apply the principles of system thinking, you never really know like what might surprise you in terms of what's out there, what might affect your life.
Unintended consequences, you don't know.
Yeah, if that part of rocket comes crashing down to a certain district in Mumbai and like crashes like on a building, I mean that building is destroyed and the people are dead. So it's just like how system thinking work. Systems out there impacting each other's life, which we don't really understand how. It only happens once you see and experience it. So yeah,
absolutely.
But great point.
Great point. Sure.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just saying that interestingly, only last year, I mean, the body which handles the outer space for the UN, they actually approved 21 guidelines for the long-term sustainability on
Oh, really?
of space. Yeah. So that
Oh, I
is
didn't know
something
that.
very. So they
That'd
have
be
the
cool to
steps how
explore.
to adapt practices. That is
All
there,
right.
and also I'm sorry. I just wanted to add because Himaki and
Sure.
Arif both spoke about the alarming trends which come by the privatization. I think one good thing which could come out of privatization could be that things and technology could become cheaper, so it is easier, and like collaborations would become easier, also giving out the possibility of more innovations. So that's a positive.
Absolutely. And I think on that positive note, we have come to a conclusion of our discussion today. Fascinating discussion, everybody on the panel. I honestly did not know much about space policy myself, and I certainly think that you've opened a lot of avenues for me to think about, and I'm sure that the audience also thinks in a very similar way, that you've at least given us some clues, some dots that we can connect to build our mental models further and inquire into space policy and how it impacts us, right from diplomacy, cooperation, and security issues to issues relating to how we do treaties and how we do cooperation right here on the earth, to waste management. So it's been a fascinating discussion, a lot more than I would have expected. And I was expecting a lot, but then you've definitely superseded what I would have hoped for. So I thank you for this discussion, and I thank all of the audience members for taking out the time and joining us. And we hope to see you in our next cohort, where we will again, towards the end of the cohort, this is almost a run up to the graduation for GPODS, wherein now the fellows who were learning from the GPODS mentors are now talking to us about these new subjects that we didn't know enough about. So we hope that you'll join us for the next cohort as well, and looking forward to that. Thank you. Good day, good night, wherever you are.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Arpit,
Thank you.
and thanks everyone.
Thank you, Arpit.